It was, in a way, inevitable. Nintendo has pioneered many innovations in gaming technology, from directional pads and shoulder buttons to analog sticks and motion controls, and sooner or later, most of them have ended up widely adopted across the gaming space. Small wonder that Bloomberg are reporting that Sony is testing out its own rival to the Nintendo Switch. To be clear, Bloomberg note that Sony's portable device is likely years away from launch, and the company could still decide against bringing it to market. Nevertheless, let's assume that Sony do manage to create a design that works for them and they feel that they can sell. It is not the first time that Sony has entered the portable space, of course, and it's not even the first time recently, with the PlayStation Portal only releasing recently, but things are very different now. As technology continues to improve and the graphical differences between handheld and television play become more subtle, the potential remains for Sony and or Microsoft to leverage their lineup of AAA content and other content as a way to drive handheld console sales, something that has strong potential to tap into a new audience and to create a new rival for Nintendo. Now, they may not tap into this potential right now, and maybe not even in the next few years, but in the long term, it strikes me that it tends towards the inevitable. Now, Nintendo has been in this situation before. In 2004, with the PlayStation Portable breathing down their necks to break up the long held dominance of the Game Boy in the console space, Nintendo added a new competitor into the mix. And despite the relatively recent arrival of the Game Boy Advance onto the scene 12 years after the original Game Boy had launched, they quickly issued their new third pillar console, which would go on to be one of their most successful ever, the Nintendo DS. Basically, when they were in a corner, Nintendo innovated their way out. I have talked before about this as a threat to Nintendo. Yes, the temptation, and for that matter, the public pressure, is almost always to iterate rather than innovate. The more perfect version of the current thing is what many people are looking for. Game Boy with colour, a Famicom but super. I've mentioned before, but the quote, probably apocryphally attributed to Henry Ford, is that if he'd give people what they wanted, he'd have built a faster horse. And yet Nintendo is always committed to innovation, and this current situation demonstrates why. The Switch form factor has had a great run at the top of the market, with the occasional competitor like the Steam Deck failing to achieve anything like the kind of mass market penetration needed to be a true threat to Nintendo's hegemony in the space. But the market is big and ripe, and Sony and Microsoft especially have the capability to muscle into the space. We will soon see when the new system is revealed whether or not Nintendo have managed to find a sufficiently strong and distinctive hook for the new system to future-proof the concept for another 8 years. But if they haven't and have gone down a more iterative pathway, then Nintendo are going to need to box a little bit clever if Sony and or Microsoft decide to add their own handhelds into this space. So, what are Nintendo's options? First of all, they need to secure the market for their new console as quickly as possible. There's little current competition, and the time for a new console is usually the period of maximum uncertainty. Remember how the N64 arriving late on the scene allowed the Sony PlayStation to get a leg up in the console wars with huge consequences. Then again, the Sega Dreamcast launching earlier than the PlayStation 2 had the opposite effect, as people opted to wait for the new Sony console over trying Sega's final console offering. In that case, Sony had built up sufficient trust that people were happy to wait. Basically, while the console business is hugely risky, there is an advantage to being established, and Nintendo needs to leverage that as much as they can. Firstly, by graduating their existing player base over quickly to new hardware. This doesn't mean that a new Sony entrant into the console market couldn't start poaching Nintendo owners later on, of course, but a strong install base to start with will definitely help solidify their position and give them options for the future. The second thing they can do is ensure that the new system is the home of so many amazing games that other companies simply can't touch, i.e., their first party content, which cannot be replicated on any other console and is of a quality and style that is rare to see elsewhere, despite the odd outsized success such as Astrobot. Historically, this is something Nintendo has been very good at, and with the company expanding, hopefully this will continue. But that doesn't mean Nintendo don't have the flexibility to cut and run if they need to. 8 years is very unusual as a console lifespan for any console, and to think that Nintendo might pull this off for a second consecutive console is ambitious. But they don't need to wait 8 years for a sequel system necessarily. Nintendo could well introduce a third pillar console like Switch was in 2017 and the DS was in 2004. Indeed, if they were ever looking to surpass the Switch model, they probably would have to, because the Switch is so well established, and to try something new would be highly risky. Now, those two worked out very well, although of course other examples of third pillar consoles like the Virtual Boy show less of a dazzling triumph. In many respects, this could make the new system, if it is iterative, closer in spirit to the Game Boy Advance or even the Game Boy Color in terms of its place in the history books. The long-awaited fulfillment of something people have wanted for a very long time, but perhaps slightly too lately delivered to garner mass appeal. That doesn't mean Nintendo needs to rush something to market, but I could well imagine 5 years in, perhaps 2030-ish, Nintendo deciding to launch something a little more experimental to try and take a big step forward into a new market. And perhaps more by luck than judgment, they actually have the perfect potential launch title for such a system: the next Zelda game. After all, it's very unlikely we will see 3D Zelda much before 2028, and if anything, given the expanding development times of the games and the fact that the next game is not going to be based in the existing world of Breath of the Wild, we're probably looking at 2029, 2030, maybe 2031 or beyond before the next game launches. And as Nintendo found out with Switch, and to a lesser extent with the Wii, Zelda can be the kind of killer app that really drives sales. In fact, the decision of PlayStation and Microsoft to target the handheld space could backfire considerably, of course. Nintendo found it perilously difficult by the end of their dual console approach to adequately service both, and focusing all their development effort on a single console certainly seems to have borne fruit on the Switch. Given that Microsoft and Sony are both playing with juicier hardware to start with, the difference between the top-of-the-line content and the kind of content that could be comfortably played on a handheld would be significant. If they decide to make software that is less powerful and more generic, it would help handheld take-up, but blunt one of the unique selling points of their product line, either splitting their attention or hobbling their ability to really maximize the benefits of their high-class tech, as they need to serve both a home and handheld market. That brings PlayStation and Microsoft onto a field that Nintendo can confidently play on. After all, if third parties decide that it isn't worth targeting the top specs on home consoles, but rather be ready to target mobile play, a massive number of third-party games become in contention for Nintendo systems in a way they haven't been until now. To be honest, the issue is less whether it will happen, but that this is largely inevitable in the long term. There are still likely to be many power upgrades to go, but we may be reaching the point of diminishing returns with games in their current form. Just as physical disc media for film have little reason to surpass 4K playback, let alone surpass 8K, the time cannot be more than a couple of decades away where even if Nintendo's console is in some respects less powerful, it will be so close to the ballpark of the others that many people won't even notice the difference. This creates risks as well, but as well as innovation, Nintendo has one other strategy up its sleeve, and that's the diversification it's been doing lately with films, theme park stores, and others. Sony and Microsoft can't really compete on this score because although Sony does have its own massive film studio, it's a very different beast from Nintendo's IP warehouse. Another possibility, of course, is that Nintendo tries to expand the concept of video games a little bit. Yoshiaki Koizumi once told an Ask Me Anything for Reddit, "I think one of the best things that you can do would be to expose yourself to other kinds of play, not just video games. It will give you a well-rounded sense of the ideas that go around the concept of play." Nintendo has always done this to greater and lesser degrees, and I don't think the core games market will drastically alter in the years ahead, but it's not necessarily the case that video games as we know them now will remain unaltered in the years to come as new technologies become integrated. For one such example, check out this video on screen right now on the potential for a Nintendo smartwatch. Thank you so much as ever for watching. Big shout to the channel's Patreon members, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo forecast.